Hello, good morning, Your Excellencies, honorable guests. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I am António Henrique da Silva, and I'm the head chairman of AIPEX. And I'm going to be just talking about giving you an overview on Angola's investing opportunities and challenges. We will start by uh, uh, touching the following subjects where we think that it's important to look at the legal frame for investment, the development zones, the investment regimes, and the challenges that we have ahead of us, and also the opportunities. On on the investment environment, or since it's also related to the legal framework that we have in place, it was necessary for Angola to adjust the the legal framework in terms of the private investment law so that it would sound and look more attractive to investors. For that purpose, we had to define 6 pillars. Those pillars are the priority sectors, the development zones, the investments regimes, investors' rights, jurisdictional guarantees, and the investments amount. Uh, it's also important here to say that because of the very much competitive market in terms of investment proposals, and since we are part of a continent where more and more such opportunities are in place, we had to focus on specific changes so that our investment law would look much more attractive for investors. So these are the key issues that we had to address, both from the size of the amount of investment that was meant to be available. So there's in the prior law, we had a limitation in terms of the amount, and the minimum amount was $1 million US for investors, foreign investors, and now there is no such an obligation. And also there was an obligation to have a local partner, and currently there's not such an obligation. And we divided the country into 4 investment zones to address the issue of asymmetries in development of the country and to promote a sustainable growth all across the country. The other important thing also is to mention the tax exemptions, where we had before less flexible environment, and now we are able to have in place, instead of the 10 years, depending on the job creation, amount of locations and sectors, production and destination, we have 3 regimes that do enable investors to be much more competitive in terms of the offering that Angola has to offer them. I will also mention here that in terms of the law and what Angola considers that it's also key addressing the investments across the country, the division of the country based on the 4 zones was focused both on the locations, meaning all those provinces that are from the coast or the coastal ones had less incentives. As you move inwards into the country, deepest into the country, or up north in Cabinda, the incentives are much higher. That will sustain on the short and middle and long term a much sustainable development of the country. And since Angola, it's a quite big country and has a lot of potential in terms of natural resources, we believe that on the long term, the results are going to be according to our expectations. So that's the map that shows the distribution of the development zones from A to Z, and having a look at it will enable you to have a much deeper understanding of what we have to offer. It's also important here to mention, related to the investment regimes, the relevant aspects of each of the projects. So we have the pre-declaration, we have the pre-declaration regime, the special regime, and I will put an emphasis on the last one, which is the contractual regime, since it enables us to negotiate on a one-to-one basis with the investors of each type of structural impact the projects have in the country, so that incentives and fiscal benefits are discussed. This has been still under review, but will definitely represent a step forward in terms of getting Angola more and more attractive for foreign investors. We have still pretty much challenges regarding some of the aspects that were important for us to address in the doing business evaluation, and those aspects partially do meant not a very positive sign, but now because of the dependency that we had on the oil and the fact that we are moving forward into the diversification of our economy, some of the aspects related to unfamiliar business environment, high cost of living for expats, logistics, supplies, infrastructures, they've been so well addressed that due to market conditions, so the oil price is low, and in terms of offering for housing and other infrastructure that are related to the well-being of investors that are willing to come in Angola, they can get them at much competitive arrangements, and that's definitely a positive thing. And it's also important to mention that the Angolan government has been developing a substantial effort in making our infrastructure at the levels that would be a boost for the development of the country. On one other point I would like to stress out is the fact about the inconsistency availability of forex for import of materials, but that's also something that has been now better addressed since the National Bank has put in place a set of measures that do address the issue of guaranteeing the forex access to investors, so that in their own activity and according to their programs and their projects, that availability is secured and the business development is assured. The human capital, unskilled labor, and language barrier. One of the highest priorities of our government has been the education sector. So besides having more and more youth having access to the educational system, there's also an additional importance that is given to the quality of the education sector. So as one of the priorities of our government policies and strategies is the improvement of the quality of education and access to the health system. Therefore, we believe that with this type of approach and with this type of priorities, we will not only secure the development of the country, but also secure that the highest value asset, which is our people, is going to be capable to develop in a sustainable manner and to promote Angolan growth according to its potential. Not less important, it's also key to mention that Angola it represents us both from a strategic point because of its geographic location, and also because of the value proposition that we have in place. First of all, I will address again the youth population, which represents 66% out of our population and is below 25 years of age. Abundant arable land, natural water, and rich in mineral resources, untouched attractions from the environment perspective that are also very key to be addressed as investment opportunities. His Excellency, the Minister of Economy and Planning, Sergio, has already touched in more details what I'm here mentioning, but just in general terms, it's important to highlight that Angola has the opportunity to represent a key investment destination, and we seek investors for partnership to integrate, develop, and scale the business sector, and also to establish major industrial presence, provide private external finance, promote competition in the domestic market, transform the state-owned oil-based economy to a private sector-orientated one, so that we are centered on economic diversification and industrialization. This will be in wrap-up manner, what we had to showcase you as an overview of the Angolan in private investment environment, and we will be more into details during the panel, which AIPEX is also part of. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, António. My name is Alexandre Gorito. I have the pleasure of being the moderator of this panel, focusing on the opportunities and challenges of investing in Angola. As you have heard, Angola has the ambition of attracting investment, local investment, but also foreign investment. Angola has been in a strong reformist agenda, focusing on improving its institutions, in improving infrastructure, in growing the private sector, in going through a privatization agenda, improving competitive environment in general. So really a strong ambition. Mr. António has also described that the challenges still exist. It's obvious that they exist. And also that nowadays Angola is facing a complex economic context with all this pandemic scenario that has strong implications. The most obvious one is the impact in the oil price that is still a key item in the economic context of Angola. So there are a lot of topics to be discussed. What are investors looking for? What are the key aspects that are taken into account when choosing the country to invest, and how to Angola ranks on these? How much has Angola progressed in terms of its ability to create proper conditions for investors? How is Angola perceived by investors nowadays? Is it a fair evaluation? Are the recent progresses already taken into account? Are there much work to be done in terms of perception? What should be Angolan priorities to attract investment that could be converted into engines of social inclusive progress? So really a set of topics that we consider could be interesting to discuss in this session. And to do so, apart from Mr. António, I have the pleasure of having Sanjeev Gupta with us. Sanjeev is Executive Director and Head of Financial Services of the African Finance Corporation. He has 30 years of experience in strategy, corporate finance, M&A across emerging markets, including Africa. He can even consider really a specialist in this topic of investing in emerging markets. He has done lectures in various universities. I also have the pleasure of having Fred Binka with us. He's the founding partner of TI Capital, a sub-Saharan independent investment firm. He's based in London, but from there covers Africa and covers the investment opportunities across Africa. He's someone with a strong financial background. I have seen in the LinkedIn that you have worked in Goldman Sachs, in JP Morgan in the past. So really someone that understands investments and understands investments in a financial perspective. Fred, maybe I will start with you. So I will start from making a set of questions myself, and I will welcome questions to be addressed to the panel itself or to any of the panelists through the chat. I will receive those, but I will start with you, Fred. So it is known that Angola historically ranked low in ease of doing business and in its ability to attract investments on the oil sector. It is also visible structured efforts to make fast and decisive progress in eliminating many of those traditional barriers. But many other countries are also doing this type of efforts, and you cover a lot of Africa and a lot of countries that compete with Angola. How do you think how would you evaluate the current position and recent evolution of Angola in the competition for attracting investment? Is it Angola more competitive nowadays? You investors that are in London or in other financial markets considering investing in Africa, how do you see nowadays Angola, and what is your current evaluation?
Thank you very much. Yes, I think Angola is seen in a much more positive light these days. If I think about our firm and also our clients, who we mobilized capital to invest in Africa. I think prior to sort of the current regime, it would have been very difficult for us to be investing in Angola. But I think the strides that sort of the government has made, really in rooting out sort of corruption and bringing in better governance into the country, is something that I think has not gone unnoticed, and I think you'll see that reflected in Transparency International's corruption index, where in the latest index, Angola moved up 19 points, which I think is a reflection of the efforts that the regime has started to make. I think the other element is and I guess where it all gets backed up is if you look at what Angola has been able to do in the last few years, it's been able to raise considerable sums in the Eurobond market, which really I think is a validation of its efforts by sort of the global capital markets in terms of the strides Angola is making. And I think given the current context, and sort of you mentioned the ongoing pandemic that we have, and that twinned with sort of the oil price dynamics, partly the pandemic, partly sort of the price war at the start of that. Angola has been in a very, very challenging situation. But I think what is impressive is nonetheless, it has managed to continue with the current IMF program that Angola is on, and has done so, with I think fairly notable performance, given the backdrop and the context. To the extent that I think not just the private sector, where I mentioned the Eurobond market, but also the multilateral sector has stepped up to support Angola in this transition phase, as it transitions from sort of a very sort of focused mono economy in oil to really sort of promoting growth in the non-oil sector, and that's reflected by the upsizing of the program that we saw by the IMF for Angola. I think there's more work to be done, but I think those steps and certainly the governance and the progress we've seen in Angola is very encouraging, and I think in that light, it is becoming and is certainly for us a key destination of capital.
Thank you, Fred. I think this is good news for Angola. Sanjeev, maybe I now go back to you. So as really a specialist in emerging markets, I guess that when an investor is considering investing in these type of markets and in Africa in general, they expect and accept that infrastructure, institutions, value chains, local talent, etc., are not as competitive as in the most developed economies. But I guess that all investors require minimum thresholds. What do you consider are the three most important factors that usually investors consider when really thinking about emerging markets? And how do you think Angola is currently perceived in those? Do you think it already ranked in a decent manner, or still has a lot of progress to be done? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, and obviously good morning and good afternoon to everybody, depending on who is where. Yeah, I heard what Fred said, and I think the intention for today is certainly not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? So the intention is to see the progress made and clearly what more needs to happen. But Alex, I'll just start off by saying this because I want to put some context to my comments later. And that is that please understand that as Africa Finance Corporation, we were set up to invest and develop projects in Africa. So for us, as I joke with my colleagues elsewhere, Africa is not an asset allocation game for us. It is the only game we play. We live by it, die by it, right? Unlike some of our other investor colleagues who decide on Africa from time to time, right? And the reason I'm highlighting it is because for us, Angola is important. Angola is not an option. Angola is one of the largest markets in Africa. It's one of the most diversified resource sectors with potential for a huge amount of industrial growth on the continent. It's got a huge population. So for us, Angola is important, which is why I'm not going to deal with platitudes here, Alex. I'm not going to tell you everything is milk and honey. It isn't, okay? As much as there has been improvement in the corruption index, it still ranks quite low. As much as we talk about the ease of doing business, Angola has slipped in the ease of doing business data. When it comes to FDI, FDI is still negative, right? Which means that there is still a lot of work to be done for investors to decide on Angola as a destination. So I just want you to understand this, that I am saying it as a well-wisher, as an interested party, as an extremely passionate Afrophile, that we need to get Angola right for Africa's sake, right? It is not an option for us, collectively. Now, when you say what are the 3 or 4 big things we look at, there's no rocket science to this. You've alluded to it. His Excellency, the President, in his opening remarks, commented on it. The Minister of Finance also mentioned. The first thing is policy and clarity and policy consistency, right? Whatever the policy is, because I hate to make judgments on policies, because that's not my job. My job is to understand policy and believe that that policy will remain for me to make sensible investment decisions around it. So consistency and clarity. Second is collaboration. No country can develop and develop sustainably if the various government departments, the various ministries, and the private sector that it is attempting to woo collaborates. There has to be an open dialogue around the key impediments around which development cannot take place unless they're removed. So to me, I want to see signs of that collaboration, of that openness, of that willingness to talk, of the willingness to listen, and the ability to act. I want to see that, right? And the third thing I'll say, which to us as investors is very, very important, is infrastructure. And infrastructure in a soft sense and in a hard sense. Roads, ports, power, human development, education matters. You cannot develop without these. Now, as I said, remember, Alex, that I consider us as AFC to be part of the solution. We are not part of the critic brigade. We are not here to criticize. So the solutions we want to bring is exactly that. Want to work with the Angolan government to develop industry and develop the supporting infrastructure that industry needs. So in other words, if you're going to beneficate your agricultural sector, you will need transport to move it to the port area for exports. You will need processing zones to add value to your exports. You will need power to be able to support the industrial activity that's happening around it. And we call it the ecosystem approach. And to me, that's critical. That don't look at a sector or an opportunity in isolation, but look at it holistically. And that is how we see, Alex, the way to go forward. As I said, policy consistency, clarity, collaboration, infrastructure, and institutions like us being part of the solution that government sees, not as part of the critic brigade, because that doesn't do anything for us. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sanjeev. I think a recipe for success that you have just described. So I guess that António has heard all this with attention, as well as some of the excellencies that are attending the session. António, having heard the Fred perspective on investors and Sanjeev's perspective on economical development and capacity to attract those investors, knowing very well Angola, what you have been trying to achieve, the type of reforms that you have been doing, what do you consider that are currently the main current opportunities in Angola? In what areas do you think Angola is already clearly in a position to attract good investment that can be successful. What are those areas, sectors, or regions, or the combination of the three? So what do you consider priorities for some of the fund managers, private investors, VCs, equities that are hearing us, really getting their attention on? So what you consider are the main opportunities right now in Angola?
Yeah, thank you, Alexandre. But it is actually important to not only look from the perspective that both Fred and Sanjeev have very well explained their views, but it's also important here to look at a broader picture where Angola as a country, as a potential that has been recognized, had to have in place, first of all, a very clear definition that comes from the top in terms of the leadership vision. So the leadership vision brought to us a plan, and according to that plan, there were also meant to be addressed structural reforms and the definition of priorities. And based on those priorities, and I will come later to that, which AIPEX also follows under that momentum, it was important to see the country as it was, to see the country as the priorities that were meant to be addressed, and with an energical move, and by putting in place the reforms that I mentioned that were recognized by the results we have been achieving already, and the international community has recognized that, because all of the constraints that we had were known, and they represent a huge setback for any willingness, both from Angola and from the outside investors world, to come into our country and in investment. So we had to show that not only we were committed, but results had to be shown. And that's the key point here, because after those signs are coming, and since investment is both about being let's say, trust building and confidence in that you are going to be able to guarantee returns on the funding that the investors are bringing into the country within an environment that is stable and that offers the same or better conditions like elsewhere in the continent. And we are seeing around the continent more and more countries adopting the good practices, tackling corruption, as I've mentioned before, and being the best choice for an investor. So Angola is not only competing with its own challenges, but it's also competing with other countries that are also looking for investment. And when we look at the potential, both from the strategic position that the country holds in Africa, since we are a coastal country located in a space, geographical space, where we can cover both the southern part and the central. We are part of two key strategic organizations, the SADC region one, and the CAC, the one that is the Community of Economic Central African Countries. Those two represent a huge potential market that needs to be addressed. Why shouldn't Angola not only look at its own need to diversify, but also to set up the right footprint to other players that might be looking at how to reach those markets? And of course, it can only be done if we have the right infrastructure, if we have skilled labor, and those also fall under the priorities that were defined by the government, especially by our leader, the President Lorenzo. So it's about having a plan. It's about looking at the priorities. It's about looking at the needed reforms. And of course, it's about getting hands-on and start working. So I really think that we are not only anymore looking at what Angola can do, but we need now to see effectively investors believing in the country, following up on the structural changes that we do, and how institutions are being performing. Because it's important also to understand, not only from data that you might have, sometimes data is not also that accurate anyway and updated, so that you are able to bring decisions when they are needed. Thank you.
Thank you, António. Fred, maybe I go back to you. You that understand very well the financial markets, the financial institutions, how they are organized, how investors tend to look at countries. So one part of the story is that we are doing the facts, the data, the progress is being done in terms of policies. The other part is the perception. So how investors, how fund managers, how sovereign funds, for example, they see Angola, they evaluate Angola. You go in a comprehensive way around the different Angolan countries. How do you think is nowadays this fact of the reality versus the perception in Angola? Is there much work to be done still in terms of perception for the country? And what do you consider are the main areas in which Angola has to also improve in terms of perception? Probably not for investors such as you that go in depth, but for others that just touch base and look a bit around and just have sound bites from each of the countries. So what would be your main recommendations for Angola to improve in the ranking of attention from investors?
I think yes, we look at sub-Saharan Africa, and you're involved in countries and investing across the region. And I think the current backdrop is that investing in this region is challenging. Sort of given sort of the pandemic and given the impact it's had on the region and some of its main economic drivers in the commodity space, but also tourism. It is a challenging time. I think when you're in those environments and it is challenging, sort of leadership and how sort of countries approach and address investors is very important. And I think Angola's done a fairly good job in that regard. We're primarily focused in the credit space, so we're a credit investor, both from sort of the corporate level going all the way to sovereigns as well. And sort of when this pandemic hit and sort of the squeeze that it's had on countries, I think there's been different approaches. Countries who have obviously wanted to protect their economies and populace in terms of sort of health spending and make sure that they can do that. And at the same time, though, effectively looking at how they could manage sort of the pandemic with regard to their economies. I think that there's been some approaches where people have said, well, look, we don't just want sort of suspension of debt, but we want cancellation. And then you've had others, and I think Angola's been very clear, who've come out and given a definitive steer that look, they honor the sort of the sanctity of contract, and that they're committed to meet their obligations. And I think sort of in that context, when you're in an environment like this, it's very easy when everything is sort of going well, but when things aren't going well, when you have leadership in that regard to really take a stand and say, well, actually, we want to meet our obligations. I think that's a big positive, and I think that's something that the private sector and commercial sector clearly notices. I think in terms of where Angola is vis-a-vis sort of other countries, the regime, I think, has put together and is very much stabilizing the economy in the context of I think we're in the 5th year of recession now. So there's been a lot in terms of the macroeconomics that has been sort of really challenging. But in that process, it's still tried to stabilize. And I think some of the decisions it's made in terms of on the regulatory side have been beneficial, and I think you'll see more of that going forward. And I particularly am thinking of, sort of the oil and gas sector, which, obviously there's a move to, diversify away from, but it will remain a significant part, I think, of the economic complex going forward for Angola. And there, the stability in the fiscal regime, and actually a sort of a more beneficial regime vis-a-vis countries like Nigeria, where actually you've seen, sort of changes that have been, probably a bit more detrimental, which has seen, sort of a switch from focus on, if you look at the offshore space, from offshore Nigeria looking more at Angola, which is seen as a more stabilized regime. So there are elements where I think decisions and stability and governance, as well as sort of the attitude towards investors, I think Angola is making progress in that light, and certainly from sort of investors' perception, I think this is very much a country where we see progress, and we see the building of an environment that is going to facilitate and enable longer term investment.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you very much. Sanjeev, I will brain pick you a bit, because I know that you are an expert in all these topics. So we just spoke about attracting investments, and we know attracting investment in general is part of the desired story. I would say that nowadays all societies are being a bit more demanding about the type of investment. So investment is as good as it is inclusive, for example, as it contributes to also to the social progress, to the reduction of inequalities, to the well-being of the society in general. And for sure, this is part of the ambition of Angola. My question is, how best do you see that the investment can be deployed in a country, and in Angola in concrete, to generate inclusive benefits, especially for women and for the youth, and in general to contribute to the development goals that all societies have the ambition to. So how do you think this can be generated to happen?
Yeah, Alex, thank you for that. I think, a couple of maxims that we all know applies universally, right, when it comes to investments, is capital by its nature is fungible, correct? It finds its anybody who has sort of read about that story, I forget, where, ultimately you find the sweetest spot. So capital always finds what the sweetest spot is. And therefore, Angola has to show that it is a sweet spot, right? And that's why perceptions matter, which is why your earlier question to Fred is relevant, that how are you going to convince investors that this change is for real, the transparency that is being brought in is actually going to be operational, etc. Now, I have a slightly sort of different view on this, Alex. I'll tell you why. Because when I see the world around, I think very often the developing world, and particularly the African continent, gets judged by a different set of standards, right? And somehow we all collectively get very defensive about what is wrong about us, rather than deciding on what is right about us, right? Because we will never going to get everything right, right? So I kind of say that it's about the coalition of the willing, that African governments must decide which are the institutions and which are the governments and which are the investors who are willing to be part of the solution, not be part of the criticism of what is still to happen, right? Because at the end of the day, Alex, the world likes a winner, right? When you start seeing investments happening, when you start seeing jobs being created, the brand automatically improves. It doesn't improve because of what you say. It's because people say, oh, wow, I missed out on that opportunity. I better not miss out on the next one. All right? So it's in that context that I want to answer your question. Angola is a very classic case. Unlike a lot of other African countries, we'll do well to remember that removing the oil and gas story, which has always been the story for Angola, it has enormous potential in agriculture, right? It has huge opportunities in fisheries and what have you. It has the entire mineral sector, which has hardly been exploited, right? Now, all of these, Alex, ultimately means that the urban and the seaside of Angola has to be connected to the hinterland of Angola. right? And the hinterland is where the mines are, the agricultural land is, and the rural community is. And that is where, if you can systematically create a process of developing agri and agri processing and then agri exports, you will by definition benefit the woman, right? You will by definition benefit the communities. So again, I have this slightly different view that rather than looking at women in isolation or rural communities in isolation, look at what the country needs. The country has resources, it needs to beneficate them. And to beneficate them, what does it need? It firstly needs connection between the hinterland and where the ports are. It needs processing zones, and it needs power and energy to process those things. And AFC, allow me to just do a little bit of marketing on AFC in this context, not because I mean to, but because I want to say that solutions exist. So today, if you see AFC, in spite of the COVID era, we successfully went and raised close to $1 billion in the last 6 months from global capital markets at extremely low rates, below 3%. No other African sovereign could do that. Now, why am I saying this to you? I'm saying this to you because there is capital out there which is looking to work in Africa through institutions and frameworks that they can trust. And we are not just the unique ones, there are others. So it is up to us to convince the Angolan government that work with us, because we can mobilize the money. And how can we mobilize it? Again, to come back to your point. Fred said they do credit. Credit is important. But what Africa needs, Angola needs, is early stage project development funding, the highest, riskiest form of funding, where you actually spend money to bring a project to bankability. We can do that. Equity funding, again, for large infrastructure industrial projects, equity funding has been a challenge in Africa. We can mobilize that. Project finance debt or credit funding comes after that, Alex. And that's why I said, remember, that the collaboration has to happen for us to show that the opportunity Angola today has is not going to be harvested by trying to talk to foreign investors all the time. Because foreign investors, by definition, like certain risk mitigations, which indigenous institutions can provide. And that's how I think Angola needs to approach the problem.
Very interesting. So moving a bit chapter, it's almost impossible to do such a session nowadays without speaking about COVID. Just the fact that we are here talking for a screen must difficult to not speak about it. António, I go back to you. The impacts on the majority of the countries, of the sectors, of the institutions have been difficult. We know that for Angola also, and we have also spoke about it. But do you want to comment on how the COVID impacted your capacity to lead with foreign investors, your capacity to attract investment? So I don't want specifically to speak about economical context that we know and others have touched it, but specifically, do you keep prepared to deal with investors? Are the institutions still working? Are you in a more difficult phase because of this? So do you want to comment what is the current situation?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a very pertinent question. And the fact that you mentioned that it's not only something that's relating to Angola, it's a world pandemic. So the effects of the pandemic are pretty much touching every country. But it's also important to state and give an emphasis to what was the reaction of Angola and the Angolan government in dealing with the pandemic. So one of the, we might be, I think I'm pretty much accurate if I say that since the very beginning, the measures that the Angolan government took do represent an advantage in terms of how we dealt with the pandemic. And we will compare that fact with the setup where Angola is located. We are in Africa. So how other countries cope with the same situation, because when comparing whatever we want to compare, we must do it in relation to similar realities. And when we see not only with those similar realities, but on the impact that the solutions that were brought up by the government, it's definitely a good sign that in terms of organization, in terms of having a structural plan to deal with the scarce of resources that we had, but still being able to limit the effect, the negative effect of the pandemic, so that it was not escalating as it did manage to happen in other geographies. And that's very positive. Of course, it has affected our way of dealing with our day-to-day tasks. We even have a new terminology for that, the new normal, and we had to adjust ourselves into that new normal. It has limited our capacity to intervene and to relate, but it also represents, it will sound a bit tricky, but it's savings from what we had previously to do as an investment promotion agency. We had to do traveling, we had to go and meet with investors on their playgrounds. So now we are much at ease in contacting much more investors on occasions like the one that has been now promoted by Invest Africa, so that we can discuss business. This is very positive, meaning on one side we had challenges, but on the other one there are some good lights in the tunnel which show that the new normal is bringing investors, investment destinations to a different level of needed cooperation and needed approach that could be staying for good. And this is very positive. Of course, we still have other challenges to deal with, but from this point of view, that you get to get closer to someone, you get to ask direct questions, you get the opportunity to diverse the opinions of those that have questions to raise. It's a very good opportunity, so we should take more and more advantage of it.
Thank you, Antonio. We are already receiving some questions from the audience, and one of them is the audience is curious to understand, Fred and Sanjeev, if in your institutions like the COVID, how did it impact the short-term and long-term strategies and view for Angola, Fred? So maybe I start with you. Has COVID changed the way you were thinking in investing in Angola in the short term and in the long term?
Yeah, I think maybe I think it's right to characterize it sort of short term and sort of longer term. I think for us, and not just from an Angola context, but sort of across the region, it's probably caused us to pause a bit on some of the industries that we were sort of previously focused on. And I think it's really when we're talking about the sort of leisure sector, tourism, and the infrastructure related to that, whether it be hotels or sort of investing in sort of logistics companies, sort of linked to that. I think there's been a bit of a pause to just understand what those sectors will look like sort of once we come out of this pandemic. And I think it's really a sort of a wait and see, sort of to assess what stable cash flows look like going forward. But in other factors, I think as Sanjeev has alluded to, I mean, for us, this region is sort of all we focus on, and Angola being sort of a large economy, and in that region, it remains sort of a focus for us. So I think it's more looking at industries maybe where they're better set up to ride the current storms, and then sort of reassessing once we're through this pandemic, how other industries more affected are going to look like going forward. And I think from a sort of operational standpoint, obviously it's limited our ability to travel. Fortunately for us, we do have sort of a footprint in the continent. So so we have a base in Lagos and one in Nairobi. But to get to sort of Angola and neighboring countries becomes a bit more challenging. But I think sort of to Antonio's point, what that does mean is that you're having to really deepen your sort of networks, sort of with local partners, to make sure you keep abreast of the changing dynamics on the ground, and that's certainly something that we've spent a lot of time doing in this period.
Thank you, Fred. Sanjeev, maybe I will repeat the question with you. So what were the short-term and long-term impacts? You have already spoken about your ability to raise recent debt, but regarding your strategy for Angola, any change, any impact that you consider mentioning?
No, so Alex, the COVID itself, I think, is a great example of why the African continent should be so proud of itself and be proud about how it's handled it, in spite of so many structural challenges that they had. And for the first time in modern history, the lack of any concerted global support around this, till at a much later stage, of course, from the IMF and World Bank. So I think this needs to be captured in our psyches as a way of going forward, that we did manage a crisis and managed it fairly well. From an AFC point of view, I think, given the sort of institution that we are, obviously in the initial days of COVID, we were anxious, we were apprehensive. We wanted to see how it played out. Certain sectors obviously got hurt more than others. Any sectors that were linked to travel, tourism, traffic, whether it's bridges, roads, railways, airports, were obviously more challenged. Then, of course, oil and gas in general, globally. But for us, there was two things that was always counting in our favor. One was we do have a very large and diversified portfolio. There is no concentration. And secondly, because of our funding and the nature of our funding, which tends to be extremely long-term, both in terms of how we fund and how we get our funding, we did not have any temporary or short-term crisis around solvency or liquidity, right? As a matter of fact, in these times, as I was alluding to earlier, or as I was mentioning earlier, we successfully managed to go into the capital markets. Firstly, we got our credit rating, which is a very high credit rating. We are a single A, the second best rated institution in Africa. And we got that reaffirmed in the height of the crisis by Moody's. And on the back of that, we went to the capital markets and proved that the capital markets were still supportive of us, which meant we had more firepower during COVID than going into COVID, right? And the way we approached investing in Africa is we had a three-pronged approach. One is obviously to look at portfolios that needed support and patience, and we provided that through restructurings. The second was projects that legitimately had to be deferred or delayed because of either supply chain problems or because some of the realities had changed, which we did systematically with the stakeholders. And the third was the few but genuinely distressed cases where we had to get into fairly serious discussions with lenders and governments around it. When it comes to Angola specifically, we have invested in Angola in the past. We currently have a couple of investments in Angola. We're looking at a couple of mining projects. We've been looking at a couple of refinery projects. And COVID didn't change that, Alex, because the long-term rationale for investing in those sectors still remain. What we did additionally was, because we saw that African governments in general and African central banks in particular were having certain dollar crises. So we systematically went around the major African governments, Angola being one, and offered them what we call foreign exchange swap arrangements, where we could bring in the dollars because we could tap into the capital markets and offer it in return for local currency, which we can use for infrastructure projects. So that's how we approach the situation generally and also specifically with Angola.
Very interesting. Thank you. So we are almost at our hour, but I wanted to guarantee that we finish in a good tone. So António, maybe I go back to you and I will ask you to tell us some concrete success story, a recent one that could inspire us and could demonstrate this ability of Angola to now attract investments. Can you tell us, without breaking any confidentiality, obviously,
No,
some inspiring success story that could really...
Well, when asking someone to tell your story, it depends also on how you feel a story should sound, big or small. But in terms of what we humbly do think it's a good way to go forward, and is a consistent way, because it does show a commitment from investors that are foreign investments that have been established in the country, that did swap from trading to industry, which shows that their commitment with the country is for to stay. And they moved, and they saw an opportunity. They saw that there is a very strong desire and a roadmap to address the import substitution. So they switched from trading to implementing projects in the manufacturing sector, which is very positive. So in those examples, which I've been seeing at the special economic zone, show clearly that there is an opportunity, and we have already examples, and we are not only talking about one or two, we're talking about, let's say, tens of them that are already doing that, and they do want to be more, but they need infrastructure to follow up that. So there is a double opportunity, both in infrastructure, and then for them, since they have their own capital or they have the funding, they want to implement the project. So we should see the value chains as opportunities, and how we should fit in within the gaps that are still existing as opportunities also to be addressed. I do look based on an integrated, say, so to speak, picture, where we need to have the full picture to understand what's happening in our country. And of course, understand also that's a phased process that needs to first tackle the main constraints, which we are doing, and then as time goes to see the results and to bring more stakeholders into our space, and so that they can develop the approach. I'm very positive about these challenges, but I also believe that the events like the one that we are now promoting are key to make that awareness of what's going on in the country, and to invite other investors to follow.
I was muted. Thank you very much. So my last words are number one, to thank you, the three of you, for your ideas and for the emotion put it on this. I think there is here a coalition of different profiles of people, the three of you with the same desire, that is clearly to be part of a solution and of a good future to Angola, a future with more investment, with more local investment, more foreign investment, and with investment that is sustainable. For me, it was also very interesting to understand, one, the level of commitment in the reforms that are being done, to understand that despite the complex situation that nowadays the world lives, long-term strategies will pay off. There are still a lot of things to be done, but there is also the notion that these things are there to be done, but there is the commitment to do it. I think we also take that different actors in the economic sector and in the financial sector will be there to support Angola. If Angola does the proper steps that is starting to do, for sure this will pay off. So I take quite a positive note. As the title of this panel suggests, there are challenges. Obviously, we have discussed a few, but there's also lots of opportunities there to be taken. So I thank you all for participating, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the sessions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.